pals, I'm here today to talk about the 9 books I read in the month of August. I think I'm just going to talk about them in the order I read them because that's what I feel like doing today. So the first one I listened to an audiobook, and that was Raven Black by Cleeves. This is the first book in the Shetland series, which has also been made into like a TV drama, and I felt like listening to a sort of crime, police procedural, mystery type series. I previously tried the Free Decline series on Jen's recommendation, which I know lots of people love, and I didn't love it. And so I thought, you know, let's try and find another author to give a go with the series. And I'd always been considering the Shetland series because, you know, it's set on the Shetland Islands and I love that type of cold, sort of rugged location. And I also like the idea of this sort of small community and remoteness. So I thought I would give it a go. So I listened to Raven Black on audio via Scribd, and I really enjoyed this one. So the premise, you follow a local detective called Jimmy Perez, who I think will be a sort of reoccurring character, and you follow this small community. You get to know a lot of people and their sort of links with one another. So again, I think in the later books a lot of these characters will keep coming back. And the premise of this is that many years ago a little girl went missing, her body was never found. A local man, who was a young man at the time, who sort of has some type of learning difficulties, was accused of the crime but found innocent, but has been ostracised by the community ever since. And then in sort of present day, it's New Year's Eve and these 2 teenage girls decide to sort of go in his house on a dare to wish him Happy New Year, and then a couple of days later one of those girls is found dead quite near his house in the snow. And you're following the investigation, and you're following people's, you know, adamant belief that it must have been this old man, and sort of how the community will deal with that. So what I enjoyed about this is, like I said, it's quite slow. I love the focus on all the different members of the community. I love the fact that it was set somewhere cold and remote, and I also didn't guess who did it, which, you know, I haven't read a lot of sort of crime type stuff. I think I'm usually fairly good at guessing in TV, films and books, but yeah, I really didn't guess this, and maybe I should have done, but I didn't, so I quite appreciate that. And yeah, I am happy to carry on and read the next one. I gave this one 3 stars, like it was solidly good, but there was nothing spectacular. But I think perhaps when I get further into the series I could start enjoying them a bit more. So there's that one. And then I moved on to a sort of 2021 release, and I've had this one for a while, and that is Kololo Hill by Neema Shah. This is very beautifully published, and the end papers look like this, which is glorious. And I picked this one up because I read sort of very early in the year We Are All Birds of Uganda, and I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend that book. And so I wanted to pick up another book focused on characters from and in Uganda, and I heard about this one and thought it sounded really good. So the premise is we're following a family of Ugandan Asians in 1972, when Idi Amin gives the order that all Asian Ugandans have a certain amount of time to flee the country. It's a very short amount of time, and he says they're not allowed to take any wealth or any of their goods or anything. So basically all these Asian Ugandans who have businesses and homes, property in Uganda just had to leave everything and flee. And obviously that was terrifying, and they had to flee. You know, a lot of them were viewed as refugees, but also a sort of an issue with, obviously it was a massive issue, but on top of that, a lot of these families had different passports, because some of the people had decided they wanted to become Ugandan residents, so they'd given up their Indian passport. And a lot of them had decided to take a British passport because when the Indian people first went to Uganda, it was the British people who were sort of controlling Uganda at the time. And this is what happens to one of these families we follow. They have a mix of Ugandan, Indian and British passports. And so you follow them in the build-up to fleeing and the sort of tension around that, the fear for their lives. There's a lot of looting, there's a lot of violence against women in those days when they were trying to flee. And also their different reactions to this. One of the characters is very fixated on belonging in Uganda, this belief that the Asian Ugandans have made Uganda what it is. There's a lot of interesting commentary on race within this, and the idea of empire, and the idea of this very hierarchical colour system within Uganda at the time. and then the sort of latter half of the novel is focused on the decision they make, and how it sort of changes all of them. So I enjoyed this book, but what I think is it's a very solid novel. It's quite a slow story, you know, there is plot, but it isn't super shocking or anything, you know, it's shocking in so much as what happened was shocking, but the storyline itself doesn't sort of pull the rug out from under you. There isn't big twists or reveals, so it's a solid storyline. I very much enjoyed it, but I felt like the writing style itself was just fine. There wasn't any points where the writing style sort of elevated the story, so I enjoyed this, but I feel like it's one that I might find quite forgettable because the writing style itself wasn't anything spectacular. I would definitely look to see what this author does in the future because I enjoyed this and I liked the characters. But yeah, I don't think this is as good as I was hoping it would be, so I gave this one 3 stars. And then I watched a reading vlog from Claire Reads Books, and she was talking about a few romances I think she'd read quite close together. I will link that reading vlog above, and one of the books she read was, well, the UK title is You and Me on Vacation by Hnery. And I read Beach Read last year when I was quite unwell. I listened to it on audio and I enjoyed it. I think I gave it 3 stars. I had some issues with it, but I enjoyed it enough that I thought, this premise sounds a bit more interesting to me. I heard Claire talk about it quite positively, and so I decided to give it a go. So I walked into the city, went into a bookshop and bought myself a copy, and I really enjoyed this, okay? I am not someone who reads a lot of romance. The vast majority of romances I've read, which is few, I have big issues in particular with sort of gender dynamics and expectations and just massive stereotyping, and also I'm not a romantic at all, and so I find it all a little bit like icky. I really enjoyed this. Now, the basic premise is that you're following 2 friends, Poppy and Alex, who met when they were at college in the US, and they were friends for many years, and they started to go on vacation together every summer, and they were always just friends. And then a few years ago they had some big falling out, you don't know why, and in the present day Poppy has reached out to Alex and tried to sort of reignite their friendship, and they're going on vacation together to sort of see if they can, you know, rebuild their friendship. And the book then sort of splits, and you have a chapter in the present day, and then you have a chapter from the moment they met, and you start going through all those previous holidays, so you find out why they fell out and all the drama that happened to bring them up to the present day. And what this basically is a story focused on the fact that Poppy thinks her feelings for Alex, they're changing, and you're sort of understanding as a reader quite early on that maybe Alex always felt a bit more for Poppy than friendship. And quite a lot of the time in the years this is going on, they're in relationships with other people. And there's a lot of commentary here on what it means to be in love with somebody in a romantic relationship, but also feel like perhaps you have a connection with somebody else that you're not doing anything about. And there's a lot of commentary about those moments where something could happen, but it doesn't because of decisions you make as individuals. And I had a real sort of personal connection to this book, because without going into loads of drama and detail, I've sort of had a similar-ish situation in my life, and a lot of this felt incredibly true to me. If I had anyone say that any aspects of this novel were unbelievable, I would categorically disagree, because a lot of the sort of emotions she described I have experienced, and this book you know, really reminded me of those moments. And also I found that this was just not overly sort of gushy and romantic. It was more realistic in its ending. My issue of this book, which is a similar issue I had in Beach Read, which I think is something she does, in both books we have a female character who is a little bit, I guess, well, a little bit privileged, and then we have a male character who has had something awful happen to him in his life, and this sort of small difficult thing that the woman's had is compared to the really awful thing the male character's had, and it ends up feeling like the male character is like coddling the female character and sort of caring for her because of this awful thing she's had. When you're, as a reader, you're like, fucking hell mate, you've had worse. So in this book, Poppy was bullied a bit when she was at school, which is of course awful. But Alex, his mother died when he was very young. His father went completely off the rails and he raised all of his siblings. So like comparably, you know, maybe we shouldn't compare things, but in the novel, they're treated like equals, and like Alex gives Poppy a shit ton of sympathy and like works, you know, she's excused in a lot of mistakes she makes because of this difficulty. And I just didn't feel like the same was true for Alex. So that was my only issue with this. I gave this 4 stars. I very much enjoyed it. I'd 100% reread it. And I think for me, this was a romance novel that I really enjoyed. Couldn't stop turning the pages, but I also felt was very realistic, which I think can't be said for a lot of romance novels that I've tried or heard people describe. So there's that one. I mean, not a fan of the cover, but yeah, I would definitely recommend the book. So then, because of the success of that book, I thought I'm going to try another romance, because I was loving the fact that when I read a genre fiction book, I want to turn the pages, like I can't stop reading, which when I read literary fiction isn't so much the case. I mean, I love literary fiction, it's my bread and butter, but I usually read for an hour and then sort of take a step away, and that's because it's not so compulsive plot-wise. I'm probably having to use my brain a bit more and like think about all this like stuff and read the sentences a bit slower. And yeah, so I just felt like reading something a bit bingey again. So I picked up on my Kindle Spoiler Alert by Olivia Dade. I'm going to be completely honest here and say that in my forays into the romance genre, I'm very much drawn in by the covers, and there's a whole sort of group of romance books that are getting these sorts of covers now, and I'm completely swayed by them, okay? So I thought I'd give this one a go. I liked the idea of it being focused around fan fiction. If you don't know, sort of before my obsession with BookTube, I had a brief obsession, probably about 6 months, with fan fiction. I read Harry Potter fan fiction at the time. Let's not talk about Harry Potter now. So yeah, I was obsessed with it. I didn't read physical books at all. I'd spent all my fucking time with my laptop like this close to my face, just like reading Harry Potter fan fiction. So I, you know, could sort of share in that nerdy thing. This is clearly based on Game of Thrones. The male love interest is clearly the guy who acts Jaime Lannister. And yeah, I mean, it's about this woman who is chatting to this man online for a lot of years. They both write fan fiction based on this Game of Thrones type show. They're really good friends. She started to feel there might be something romantic, and we find out that he is actually the actor, and he, because of some weird Twitter thing, they end up going on a date with one another. She doesn't know who he, or she does know he's this famous actor, but she doesn't know he's this man she's been talking to for years. And he very quickly realises who she is, and it's about this push and pull as he pursues a relationship with her without revealing who he really is. So, issues I had with this book. I think his reasons for not revealing who he was were pretty sound, you know. Contractually, he's in massive shit if he's seen to discredit the show. In his sort of fan fiction persona, he has very much slagged the show off online. So yeah, I think as a character she handles some things pretty badly. I also think it is a little bit weird that she's written a lot of fan fiction about him being in situations sexually, and then like they meet. I don't know, it's a bit weird. And also by the second half it just became like sex scene drama, and there's this like side character who's another actor, and his storyline is ridiculous, and like the next novel, this is like going to be a spin-off world, is based on him, and I'm just like, it's just a joke, like it's ridiculous. So I gave this 2 stars in the end. I really binged my way through it, and then by the end I was like, this is just bad. So I wouldn't recommend that one. And the next I read a memoir, and that is Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. I had such high hopes for this. I included this on a list of books that were all memoirs and personal essays that were coming out this summer, which I'll link above. And so when I saw my library had a copy, I was incredibly excited. So I was a bit disappointed by this, which is a shock for me. I really love memoirs, and it's odd for me to give a memoir less than 4 stars. I ended up settling on 3.5 for this. And I still feel sort of guilty about it, but let me sort of talk it through. So this memoir has been marketed as being focused on the fact that Ashley Seaford's father was in prison for the majority of her life, for a really long time. And she struggles with a sense of who she is and a sense of being loved and cared for because of the sort of loss of her father. It's always strange from one another. She doesn't visit him when he's in prison. And so you're told it's like a discussion about incarceration, how it affects not only the people who are incarcerated, but the people who are left behind. And also you as a child working through the fact that somebody who was supposed to be there to sort of care for you, especially this father figure, may have committed a crime that contradicts that. And that is part of the narrative, but I would say like 20%. In large part, this is about her relationship with her mother. So her mother had a lot of anger issues, especially when Ashley was a young girl. And this is really a discussion about Ashley's life from the sort of the moment she remembers. And she had a sort of very close relationship with her siblings, in particular her younger brother. And this is about the struggles they have. And there's periods in her life when she lives with her grandmother instead of her mother because her mother is very volatile, and in that volatility quite violent and aggressive. She has a stepfather who's pretty sort of awful and manipulating. And also, in large part, this is a commentary on, in particular, how young black girls are told to behave. When she gets to a certain age and she starts to develop, she's told that she has to cover up and she has to do all these things to negate men and boys being interested in her. And she's told all these ways in which to be fearful, but yet also not given enough protection from those fears. And also told these fears in such a way that she begins to believe that if anything does happen to her, it must be her own fault. And so she's an incredibly nervous child, and a lot of this book is about that anxiety, just moments of sheer terror she had for like such a small thing that she felt would be made into such a big thing by her mother. So that's in large part what this book is about. And I guess my two issues with this book are one, I feel like perhaps structurally this wasn't particularly strong. And that's just because I love memoirs, like everything this is talking about I love, but I just feel like maybe the structure doesn't make this book super memorable, or like the structure just doesn't make sense as like a narrative arc. So yeah, like it's not always told in order, which I'm fine with, but it just didn't seem to flow to the best it could have. I think it could have been structured better. I'm not quite sure how, but I think it could have been done better than this. And my second issue is, and this is where I struggle with memoirs, and I'll discuss this with another memoir later in the video. Are you judging the way in which this person it writes about their life and the sort of things they explore, or are you judging them as an individual? Because I guess I don't want to spoil anything about this narrative, but what I will say is at a certain point Ashley finds out what her father is in prison for, and she didn't know for a significant portion of her childhood. And it's horrific. And it's touched on to a very small degree. And I just thought it should have been discussed more. And I didn't want this book to become a narrative that focused on his crime rather than on the victims, because that is completely, I disagree with that completely. But I also felt like Ashley's life, things she's experienced that were horrific, are things her father has perpetrated against others. And she doesn't really talk about that. Like, as soon as you hear what he's done, you're like, fucking hell, like, how are you going to have a relationship with this man? Like, and I know, as somebody who believes in redemption and forgiveness and doesn't believe in the incarceration system we have, I sort of wanted her to tackle those things and to discuss them. And like ultimately it's her choice not to, but it also feels a bit odd putting this book out there if you're unwilling to discuss those things, because it's such a large question. And yeah, I just found that a bit I don't know, I found it a little bit uncomfortable, especially because there were victims of his crime, and yeah, and so I like that he was given the right to be an individual and not just a person who'd committed these crimes, because anyone can be more than what they've done many years ago. But I also felt like, as a daughter of that man, it would be really difficult to come to terms with, and she doesn't really examine that all that much. So yeah, I'd be really interested to see what other people think of this one, so I'm interested in hearing other reviews. It's getting a really positive response, like the Goodreads ratings are really high, but I read a few ratings where people had said similar to what I was thinking. But yeah, I'm interested to hear more. I would pick up whatever she writes in the future. She writes very well, but I just had a sort of couple of niggly points with this one. The next book I'm not going to talk about much at all because this video is already too long, but I absolutely love this book. It's one of my favourite reads of the year, and so I'm going to do a separate video about this in the next week or so. And that is A Crooked Tree by Mannion. This is a brilliant coming of age novel, I think set in the 80s or 90s, and I adored it. It has sort of a dark edge. I think it's been mismarketed as something of like a crime thriller. That's, you know, in small part what the novel is, but it's a really interesting coming of age story, but also a really interesting family to follow. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Everything about this book is wonderful. If she had written any other books, I would have immediately bought every single one and just read them. But this is her debut novel, which is super exciting because there's obviously lots of great things to come, and I adored this book. I would happily just reread it immediately. So I'll do a proper video talking about this one. But for now, just know that I gave it 5 stars and I adored it. And the next one is a book I got from the library. Again, this is a 2021 release like the previous one, and that is Lullaby Beach by Stella Duffy. This is a fairly short historical fiction mixed with a contemporary narrative. So this is a sort of, I think, a narrative that's done fairly often, but I think was quite successful in this one to a point. And that is that in present day, this woman called Kitty, who is, I think, in her 80s, she is a great aunt. She has no children of her own, but she's incredibly close to her nieces and her grand-nieces. She kills herself and she leaves a sort of mysterious note behind. None of her family can understand why she's done it, and they start to try and re-examine their relationships with Kitty and her past and what they may not have known about her. And at the same time, we go back to when Kitty was herself around 17, and we follow her story for a few years and find out that some really awful things happened to her in those sort of early years in her life, and they really shaped her life and what she decided to focus on. And what was really interesting about this was, as a discussion on, I guess, how certain things can happen in your life that really shape who you are. So when you meet Kitty as a young woman, she's very interested in the glamour and glitz of life. She wants to move to London because she wants to be in the centre of everything, and she's sort of imagining this life filled with drama and luxury. And you know, but as an old woman, she lived in basically a converted beach hut. And when she had worked, she'd been a district nurse and she'd worked in lots of women's centres, and was known throughout the community as being incredibly, like, a very central role in women's health. And when you meet her as a young girl, you're like, Kitty, I can't imagine you caring for anybody, even someone you like loved, even your own mother, can't imagine you caring for, let alone all these other people. But in those segments you start to see how she became a woman who did do that. This is pretty brutal. There's quite a lot of very sad and triggering things in this, so I would say consider that. There's quite a lot of violence against women in multiple ways, and there's also quite difficult discussions to do with children, sort of pregnancy and women's health to do with that, so I'd be aware of those things. I thought this was a really solidly written book. I felt the historical narrative was much stronger than the contemporary narrative, and what pulled this down to 3 stars for me was that I thought the last sort of 50 pages of the contemporary narrative were very plotty compared to the rest, and a little bit messy and just silly, and I felt it really let the book down. And yeah, I was just a bit disappointed because I feel like she was handling this really well, and she should have either not had so much plot at the end, or if she was going to have a lot of plot at the end, made this a longer book. It's 250 pages, And for all the stuff that happened at the end, I just think it needed a bit longer. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting book in its commentary. So Stella Duffy herself works with, I think, with women and with sort of like women's health and things like that. And you can see throughout this book she clearly knows a lot about that. And you learn about all of these women, and a lot of these women's lives in this family have been touched by sort of male privilege and male violence, and yeah, and it's very interesting. And I don't think it felt heavy-handed. It didn't feel like, and here's an example of this, and I'm going to use this character to illustrate that. It felt real, but I just felt like the ending was a bit messy, and I felt like it sort of made me feel disappointed at the end, basically. Then these last two I was very kindly sent from Picador. This first one I was sent an advanced reader's copy of, so I'll put a picture of the finished book up here, and that is The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This is a short story collection, and I feel really torn about this collection because I absolutely loved the first three stories. I thought they were like pure brilliance, phenomenal, couldn't even believe that somebody could write such excellent short stories, was in love. And then I felt like the middle few were good, not quite as great, but still like really good. And the last couple I didn't love as much. And the last one is actually a novella, and that's the title story, and it's around 100 pages. And it was a bit more abstract and sort of weird than the previous stories. And I just didn't enjoy that as much. Like, I much preferred when she was doing really realistic stories, and I just found that sort of absurdist edge to the final story made me have a bit of distance as a reader. And also I feel like perhaps I just wasn't quite intelligent enough to understand all the nuances of it, so that was a bit of a shame. But I would have 100% advised you pick this collection up because, like I said, the first three were brilliant, and then the middle few I still really enjoyed, would give them like 4 stars. And even like the last two, I'd still say were like 3.5 stars. So I gave this collection 4 stars overall. The brilliance of the first few, it was just amazing. My favourite story, I've heard lots of people talk about Boys Go to Jupiter, which is follows a white woman. So I think all of these stories have a black woman as their protagonist. There's one that doesn't necessarily have a protagonist, but when they do, they're usually a black woman. But this one follows a white woman, and I've had lots of people talk about this one because it's a story where there's a photo was posted online of this white woman wearing a bikini with a Confederate flag on, and it's sort of about the repercussions of that in the age of like internet culture and things like that. And what I found interesting is there's an awful lot of backstory to that that really elevates the story to be so much more than this like initial commentary, which I thought was phenomenal, and I really did love that one. But my favourite one was the second one, which is Richard of York Gave Battle in Vain, which is about a wedding in which our protagonist, who's sort of in her early 30s, and she is a professional photographer. She sort of is a sort of photojournalist, and she's won awards. She travels to war zones, and quite a few years previously she was trying to travel back to the US, and there was a sort of bio threat on the plane she was on, so they were grounded. And there was one other American on the plane, which was this man who she got to know. And in the present day, she's at his wedding. And his wife has always been a bit fearful that maybe they had sex with one another and like had this affair, and there's this sort of romance continuing. And so she's a bit off with her. And something leads to them sort of being thrown together. And you sort of follow what happens after that. And I just thought it was brilliant. I thought there's sort of parts of this protagonist's past that are brought into the story that I really thought were written excellently, and also the decisions made by this bride at a certain point in the story I really admired and just thought was conveyed brilliantly. So yeah, I definitely recommend this collection. I know she has another short story collection out. I'm not sure if she has any novels, but I will definitely be having a proper look into that and picking up whatever she has, because like she has that sort of writing style where I don't even know how to describe it, because yeah, it's like just brilliance. I don't even know, let's see if anyone else has written. So Roxane Gay says the finest short story writer working today, which based on the first few stories that I loved, I I would very much agree. Like, everyone's talking about sort of what the stories are about, which is excellent. She dives into a lot of themes which are very interesting. Says the subjects of grief and apology, race and history, and the cost of setting the record straight, which it is, but no one's really described what type of writing it is. Maybe no one else is able to describe it either, but yeah, you very much get the feeling that she must just be super articulate in like every conversation because she comes across as incredibly intelligent and articulate, and like her emotional capacity with all of these characters she presents is astounding. So yeah, there's that one. And then lastly, I have lent this out to, if John and I are married, he would be my brother-in-law, but we're not married, so my boyfriend's sister's husband. So it's easy to say brother-in-law, isn't it? But there you go. So I've lent him the book because it is Crying in Mart by Michelle Zauner, and he likes Japanese breakfast, so he wanted to give her memoir a read. Loads of people have been raving about this one. I think in large part it's got a really brilliant cover in the US. So I've put the UK cover up, somewhere on the screen. I'll put the US cover up as well. You can decide which one's better. I think we all agree it's the US one, but there we go. So, I didn't think I'd ever heard of Japanese breakfast, and I just like memoirs, and I'd heard people talk about this one. People had said that it is a memoir about Michelle Zauner's mother dying and how she really didn't know how to cope with the grief and the loss of her mother, but also Michelle Zauner is mixed race. Her father is white American and her mother was Korean American. And Michelle Zauner was actually not born in the US, although I'm not sure she was born in Korea either, can't remember. But how when her mother died, she felt not only the loss of her mother, but this massive disconnect to her Korean culture and sort of family history. And also people said there was lots of discussions of food and Korean food and cooking, and I thought that all sounded really interesting. So I thought I'll give it a go. When it arrived in the post, I was sort of reading the blurb about Michelle Zauner, and it said, oh, Japanese breakfast, they were described as shoegazing indie pop and like dreamlike, I think. And I said to Johnny, this sounds like the sort of music we'd really love. I'm really surprised we don't listen to Japanese breakfast. And he was like, we do, we've been listening to the new album all week, you just haven't noticed. And I was like, oh yeah, I really enjoyed that song actually, I just didn't realise it was Japanese breakfast. Bit embarrassing. I really like music, but I'm really bad at actually paying attention to who's singing the song I'm enjoying. So yeah, I do like Japanese breakfast, as it turns out, I just didn't realise. Memoir, okay. I mentioned earlier with Somebody's Daughter that there was another memoir I had mixed feelings about, and this is that. So, I'll describe what it's about. I felt like, especially in the first half, the writing style itself I didn't think was excellent, and like I said, I love memoirs. I think in large part memoirs have the ability to be written more beautifully than any other book because they're so intimate, and somebody is trying to articulate memories which imbues them with nostalgia, and I think that's something as humans we have this intense obsession with, like memories and nostalgia, but also they're really personal, and I think somebody examining the way they feel quite brutally, like being searingly honest to, you know, everyone who may want to read this, is a big thing. And so I think they have the ability to be written astoundingly well. This is well written, but I didn't find my breath being taken away at any point. So there's initially that. I was like, yeah, solidly well written, good, but it's not like great. I did find the second half more interesting, but I think and this is again sort of what I said with Somebody's Daughter, like, if your issues are with what they're writing about as individuals, is that okay? Because they're allowed to feel how they want to feel, and they're allowed to decide what to write about. But a sort of issue I had with this book, which sounds like a criticism of Michelle Zauner, and I guess it sort of is, so like I feel bad, is that the discussion surrounding her mother's death felt to me to be more focused on Michelle Zauner thinking about who she became once her mother had died. So I felt like it was more talking about Michelle Zauner losing her mother than her mother losing her life. Does that make sense? So yeah, I felt like to a degree there was a section of the book at the end which I thought brought it back a little bit more for me, when she's trying to sort of learn more about her mother through her mother's sister. And there's a part in the book where her mum says to her, her mum says to her, always hold 10% of you back. From whoever you're with, hold 10% back for you. And I thought that was beautiful. And once her mother dies, Michelle Zauner is thinking, I wonder if that 10% was the same for all of us, or if by talking to everybody who knew my mother, I can gain back that 10%, so I can know everything about her. And that was, I guess, more what I thought this memoir would be like. So yeah, it's really hard because clearly it's her memoir, and if this is how she feels about it, then that's fine. But, you know, we're all different, right? But like my stepdad died a couple of years ago, really unexpectedly, and I'm very aware that I don't want him only to come into conversation between family when we're talking about how hard it is without him and how much we miss him. I want those conversations to also be about how shit it was for him that he died at 57, and that he had so much more life to live, and what a great person he was, and how funny he was, and all those things. And so I felt a little bit like that book would represent like all of the conversations of my stepdad, or like 90% of them being about like what it's like living without him, rather than like what it's like for him to not live. Does that make sense? So yeah, I think that came through a little bit in the last couple of chapters, but I think in large part this felt more focused on Michelle than her mother. I don't know, like, have you read this? What are your thoughts? I don't know if I'm being too harsh. I also think we're all going to come at this book from really personal angles, and like I said, my stepdad died really suddenly, and something I try and think about is how shit that was for him. Like, yeah. And not that it isn't shit for the people left behind, but the person it's shittest for is the person who went to work at 57 and didn't come home. Do you know what I mean? Like, so maybe that's me bringing like my perspective to the memoir. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I gave it like 3.5 stars. I can see why a lot of people are raving about it. But I will also say, being someone who loves and adores memoirs, if you think this is good, then God fucking hell, read some other memoirs as well, because there is some memoirs out there that are like pure fucking poetry, okay? I'll link a video above where I talk about 5 of my favourite memoirs, so if you haven't read them, go and read them all because they're brilliant. So yeah, that is my August wrap up. Let me know, a bit of a mixed bag, but I think even the ones I didn't enjoy, I was sort of finding it quite interesting thinking about what didn't work for me and what did. So yeah, have you read any of these? What are your thoughts? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.